I have been a part of what you call gun culture for about 15 years, and today we are going to reflect on some of the lessons that I have learned in that time, but also some of the things that I might have done differently if I were able to go back. In the last 15 years, if you were to mark my first induction into gun culture by joining the military, it started with time in service. I was in 75th Ranger Regiment. I did 4 deployments with them. And I moved on after that to work within a private contracting capacity. And after that, I shot competition. And after that, I started editing for a primary magazine in the United States. And as a result, what we've moved on from there is an intriguing combination of those contributions. And while this is me talking about my history, I want to talk about a couple things that are relevant to gun culture, taking a bit of a break again from the heavier philosophy side of this redacted culture cast and talking about what we've seen change in that time, as well as perhaps some things that I would have done differently. But in order to start at 15 years ago, I really have to go before that. When I was about 13 years old, my father bought me a broadsword, which is in some groups to be considered mega based, but it represents a loop that a loop or a pattern that can be traced not only in the macro scale but in these different examples across gun culture. Particularly, one of the first things that I did when my father bought me this broadsword is I went out and I damaged property, let's call it. But very quickly, I actually broke it. I snapped the blade off at the hilt. It was winter, and I was shocked. I was naive at that time at what a sword could do. But at the age of 13, I was also more naive about the physical capabilities of a broadsword than I was about a firearm. My family had taught me how to shoot, and they had taught me how to be safe with a firearm, how to check to see if it was loaded. And many of these lessons came in the context of doing things. I learned how to shoot as a child because my father would go hunting with my grandfather. I learned how to shoot more from my grandfather, who was a veteran of Korea and World War II. I learned how to, safely take care of firearms, maintain them, because my dad always cleaned his firearms after he used them. And he would teach me things like don't put your thumb on the barrel without cleaning it off. Otherwise, the oils on your skin would rust the metal. And this put me in a position such that when I got into the military and I shot an M4 for the first time, the experience was rather underwhelming. Contrary to what um, the political conversation might be, the first shots out of an AR-15 or in that case an M4 were nothing spectacular. It was simply a tool doing what it was supposed to do. And that allowed me, for at least a window of my time in the military, to become to be able to focus more on what we learned there anyway, which was less on the physical manipulation of the firearm and more of its application in a much greater event, which would be like doing a night raid, doing a react to contact, a break contact, an ambush, react to near and far ambush, these kind of battle drills that are listed in the Ranger Handbook, which anyone can purchase. And it is also a kind of a skill set that it seems like gun culture is begging to start engaging in. How do we learn how to do these things? Why does it seem so difficult for the average American in the year 2023, almost 2024, to learn how to do these things that we teach 19-year-old kids to do, 18 and 19-year-old kids to do in the military? But we're going to get to that later. So in the military teaches you a number of things, and it really isn't that much of a surprise. Despite what you will see in internet conversations, learning how to shoot is only a small subsection of the great skill sets that are expected out of somebody in that capacity. While the internet will complain and argue over whether or not you should be learning how to do recce or long distance patrolling, or whether you should learn to be safe or strong in the mountains, or whether you should learn how to do CQB, the reality is we expect 19-year-old kids to be good at all of them, or at least comparable. At least not comparable, but competent in them, capable enough to be able to execute within a group environment. And so the if this ends up kind of dissolving some of the mystery behind these skill sets, that is part of the process. And so going back to the experience of when I was a child and had this broadsword, which we broke and then we sent back, and then I got another one, and I still have that one to this day. It's no longer in this room. But what it is, what I had to learn very quickly was that I had naive ideas about what a firearm or what a sword could do, what a sword did, and that those naiveties were swiftly corrected when I broke my toys, if that's what you want to call it. And so in the military, you learn a lot of different things, of course. You learn some of them are just simply cultural, how to operate in a squad environment, how to be apart away from home, how to deal with the pressures of the day in and the day out, how to handle learning new skill sets. I mean, some days your team leader's teaching you how to do a reload, and then some days you're shooting an M3 Carl Gustav, and some days you're learning how to hotwire a car, and most days you're literally just doing some form of tedious maintenance. And yet for all of the, what do you call it, hero, it's not really hero worship, but that's probably the best metaphor for right now that we see in direction of gun culture towards the military. We do, as veterans, remember many hours spent doing very little. Yes, I can find the prettiest rock, or whatever you want to call it. But so while I was in the military and I did 4 deployments with Ranger Battalion, I learned quite a bit. But I left that place in 2013 and I started working within a contracting environment, and I did that for a while. And because of NDAs, which make it sound cooler than it really is, I shouldn't talk too much more about it. But after contracting for some time, I had moved back to my home state, gotten married, and started shooting competition, particularly USPSA and 3-gun. I had shot an IDPA league, or not a league, but I had shot a couple matches of IDPA before. And for those who are not familiar with the competition world, IDPA and USPSA are two different, um, think of it as kind of schools within competition shooting. And my experience with the USPSA crowd was much better than my experience with the IDPA crowd at that time. And many of the people who shot ID or USPSA went on to shoot things like 3-gun as well. And so naturally, I got mixed up into all of this. I still remember the first time that I shot a 2-gun competition. I had as my, I think the two firearms that I had, because it was pistol and carbine, was a Smith & Wesson MMP 9 VTAC edition. I think I had put a different trigger in it by then. I think I'd put an Apex trigger in it by then. So I had a Smith & Wesson MMP 9 with an Apex trigger, I think, and I had a Warsport LVOA with some, probably a lower end Bushnell 1-4 LPVO style optic on top of it, which eventually didn't hold up to the recoil, but that was a long time ago. And it was like a $200 optic. So yes, I literally had the meme gun, a $3,000 rifle with a $200 optic on it. But it could have been a red dot too. It could have been a T1 micro. I don't quite honestly remember. And what I learned in competition were the skills, the individual skills on drawing a pistol, reloading reliably 100 times. Every time your reload is within a certain reliability range of time. It happens every time you start planning when to do it. And competition is where you learn to shoot. You learn to shoot well, fast, and accurate. And there's this weird cultural conversation that comes up every once in a while within gun culture, and you can really tell that a person is starting to mature when they realize that argumentation isn't worth engaging with. And the argument, or that type of argument, is not worth engaging in. And that's the argument of, is it better to shoot, is shooting tactically better than shooting competitively, or is competitive competition applicable in the real world? And the kind of the debate is it pits these two ideas against each other. Should you, it's, well, tactical shooting is different than competition shooting, which should be broken down into, the skill of shooting itself is different than the application of that skill set in a dynamic human environment. One of them has the objective of learning to shoot well is to win a competition. The objective of learning to shoot tactically is to find, fix, and kill your opponent, and that's a very different game. However, there is no situation in the world where being better at shooting a firearm does not make you a more competent tactical individual. It at least supports it. It's not an. It's not a. It's not. It doesn't. You. There's no situation where you would not be better off being better at shooting a firearm, better at shooting more accurately and more quickly in a tactical space than not. And so the question really comes down for people is, I only have a limited amount of time. Where do I invest it? Which we'll get to again as we continue. So gun culture at this time. Now, I was shooting competition in 2015 into 2016. And I was shooting USPSA and 3-gun, and you got to see a pattern emerge of people's skill sets. And that is that you could divide any group of competitors at any match that you went to into 3 different groups. You had the bottom 80%, which consisted of newer shooters, people who were very much so more in the hobbyist. They did it more for the fun and they were less serious about the sport. You had people who were learning, but who had not quite yet become uh, intimate, is probably the best word, with how the rules of the game are played. They had not quite, they had not quite built up the habit of, like, they knew how they come to the stage. They start planning their stages out. They know how to set their gear, and they were learning a lot of pieces. But once you got past that 80%, you got into the second group. And remember, we got 3 different groups here for competition. You've got your bottom 80, your top 20 minus the 1%, and then you have the top 1%. So, in this bottom 80%, it was a combination of newer shooters. It was newer shooters, more casual competitors, and maybe kind of like a support crew kind of concept, or people who had not quite yet figured out the flow of how competitions were run. But if you got into that upper 20 percentile mark, you'd look at competition shooters as this batch of competitors were all either trying to get to a certain position, like maybe they wanted to reach grandmaster or master within a certain field, or a certain discipline, as we call it, or they were starting, or it's not even, or they were starting to get better at the specific minutia of the game. They had already ironed out a decent amount of their gear. I mean, they were still making adjustments for sure, but they had ironed out a decent amount of that, and now they were at a heavy skill development phase where they had to improve specific skills, like, I need to get better at drawing a pistol. I need to get better at my shotgun reloads. I need to get quite specifically better at having my sights on target by the time I get to the exact point in the match that I want to, or in the stage that I want to shoot. And these competitors were all, they basically competed amongst themselves, and that was but their ambition, they competed amongst themselves, but their ambition was always to move up into the next phase, which is to get into that top 1%. Now, I never reached the top 1%, but I got to watch people do it, and there was something that changed in them. We had Josh Freilich on the show a while back, and he talked about it a little bit, where he stopped paying so much attention to getting the latest piece of gear and was heavily focused on practicing deliberate skills, specific skills. And then you really got to see him go from good to great. And he deserves credit for doing that. And I was thankful that I got to watch that take place. And so I competed for a while and I got to learn a lot more of the skills. From this point in my timeline, growing up in a family that was familiar with firearms provided a little bit of that cultural foundation. I learned how to be safe. I learned how to use them. I learned different ways that they were used. And I had so much less mysticism around the firearm, more so around using the example from the beginning about a broadsword. I had so much less mysticism about using a firearm that when I got into the military and I shot that M4 for the first time, it really wasn't it was a really underwhelming experience. It really wasn't anything magical. But instead, we learned how to shoot other guns and we learned how to do other things. And so in the military, I already had a little bit of a base of skill, very small, but just enough to be competent that allowed me to focus on all of these different applications. And then after I got out of the military, I started and stopped contracting. I started learning how to do things. I started competing, and in competition, that's where I learned how to shoot much better, whether it was handgun, carbine, or otherwise. Mind you, while I was in the military, I was able to attend a designated marksman class and learn our course and shoot at I think distances up to 1,300 to 1,400 meters. We're using meters at the time, and that was a beneficial experience for me. I got to use an M110 by Knight's Armament, and it was a really good experience learning how to range a target, learning how to determine wind at distance, learning how to gauge or deal with windage and make adjustments to optics and deal with parallax and all this kind of stuff. And so those were all little teeny toolbox that continually added to being a ranger. But then contracting taught me a different set of skills that were in some ways a lot more interpersonal. And then moving into competition, those skills, the specific skills that I learned there were much more focused around the firearm itself. But I wasn't competing forever. By about 2017, I had greatly reduced the amount of time I spent competing. I was in college doing a double major. I only had so much time left in my brain. Minnesota only allows competition for a certain window because of the summer, and it was an expensive sport to be participating in. And then after I graduated, I kind of went through this depressing period, but then that's not really related to gun culture. But after that, eventually I found myself editing for a magazine. I was editing for Recoil, and that was quite an honor. I had been writing for some time for some publications, and the right timing lined up where they needed a person to fill a position, and they hired me. And what did I learn writing for the magazine? I learned a lot of what happens behind the scenes within gun culture, how companies produce products, how influencers review equipment, how companies engage with the public, what marketing options are no longer available, what happens in the biggest of pictures when it comes to, or the second, not quite the biggest, but the second biggest of pictures when it comes to gun culture. And that is, what does this entire, let's call it broader community, do? How does it interact with itself? How does it function? How does it support itself? Where does it not? And also during that time of editing for Recoil, you had the Minneapolis riots kick off. And so I got to get boots on the ground experience in stateside contracting and see what the hell was going on in my home city. Or it's not really my home city, but let's get off with semantics. And so you got to see a combination of these things all coming together. I got to see a little bit into what the competition world was going on and what the tactical world was going on and what the marketing space was looking like and what the social media space was looking like. I had all these different things happening, whether it was law and legality over here to writing and culture over here. And it was an interesting time. And during that time, I got to see where people were hungry, and that was for community building, which then led to eventually where we are at here with Redacted. And I left the magazine and I started this publication, and now we do these episodes talking to you. And so, if you were to take the last 15 years of timeline, there was a chunk of it that the first almost half of it was taken up by military time and private contracting. And then there was time competing, time writing, and now here. And mixed in everything from that, when that competing time ended, was continual participation in competition shooting and skills development and taking courses and traveling and seeing who's doing what, and how to add to this culture. But it also, where it ends, where it began, where as a young child I learned how to shoot a rifle, and I learned how to shoot a handgun, and I learned how to, or I learned the values that my father held, which drove him to choose to get his concealed carry or carry a firearm at all. And it was, I got to watch as a young man, I got to watch my father make those decisions. And it always then, I got to watch him make those decisions at a time where we were playing Halo, and video games were coming into prominence with like first person shooters, and it was, there was a distinct contrast there. There wasn't any glory in it for my father. It was a sense of duty and responsibility, and that sense of duty and responsibility he chose to pass on to his children, which has then started this long chain from military experience to private contracting experience to competition shooting to involvement with a church security team to teaching and instructing and developing skill sets. And now I get to sit back 15 years later and look at this body where I've forgotten more than I can remember to list, and try to talk about 15 years of gun culture development. Before I left for the military, I had never shot an AR-15 that I can remember. And now they're so ubiquitous that so many people have them that it's sort of an anomaly if somebody doesn't. Uh, when I was a child, owning a plate carrier was an impossibility. No one would think about it. Almost as impossible as owning night vision, and now here we are. We have civilians looking at thermal technology. We've got people trying to figure out drones. We've got the cultural influences of individual responsibility, and this whole thing continues on. And I want to talk a little bit about gun culture in terms of groups. I've seen many groups rise and fall, and some persist. And I've seen groups rise where you have a group of people get together and they start spending time with each other. They set a day apart each month to go spend time with each other, and they do that every month, month after month after month. And eventually, I've seen them fall. I've seen some of them fall apart because of arguments over something that could be as dismissive as rank, as if in some fictional apocalypse, who's going to be second in command, and how ridiculous that can be. And the things that cause our gun culture to fall apart are rarely the the gun part. It's almost always the cultural part. I'm sure gun. What is it? I'm sure the sort of uh, what do you call it? I'm sure that the kind of wicked person who would perceive the idea of gun control as a good thing would be eternally frustrated by the fact that the most equipped peoples in this United States are the least likely to participate in violence. And while we're not expecting intellectual honesty out of it, at least we can say within our own framework, gun culture doesn't solve its vendettas with violence, despite our capability, and that is a testimony to the values that we hold. Um, so going back to the beginning, in all of these places, whether it was in the military, whether it was in competition shooting, whether it was editing for Recoil, or whether it was in the production of this podcast, every single time I have entered into these new environments naive. Just like when my dad gave me that broadsword, I had these ideas of what the world was like that didn't quite add up. When I thought of a broadsword, I thought of the Master Sword from Legend of Zelda. And in the time of my youth, when the Master Sword from Legend of Zelda came from Ocarina of Time, I think Wind Waker, you couldn't break the thing. There was no breaking the sword. This is well before Breath of the Wild. Um, and that naivety literally shattered when I snapped the blade off of a sword. And then from there, I had to learn what does it do? What is it capable of? And you can kind of engage in nerdiness as time goes on. And of course, absent opportunities to experience it, you might develop bad or incorrect beliefs, like, this sword is so much stronger than that one, or whatever. But what that reflected on in the military is that I had this idea of what military work looked like and what learning to shoot and being a ranger was, and that naivety was eventually torn down by reality and had to be replaced with something. I became rather cynical until I had to put that cynicism away. And learning how to do an ambush or a raid in the military oftentimes can come across as frighteningly simple. Base of fire, maneuver element. You have one group that stays and one group that moves, and you create what people call an L shape. It's overused jargon, but let's get to the point. And you go, well, that's this simple. Where's the secret sauce to tactical training? And the secret sauce to tactical training was doing an L-shaped ambush or a react to contact 100 times. Learning how to fast rope out of a helicopter is not something that you just do once. You keep doing it over and over again until you build a base of capability that you can expand out into the field. Learning how to use use radios in conjunction with other people, move elements, become a team leader. These kind of elements, these kind of processes all are what make up so much of the capability of the military. It's much less on the individual skill alone, although there is a baseline that is expected. There's a baseline for every person in Ranger Battalion to be able to shoot so accurately, to be able to run a certain, at least at a bare minimum, a certain speed for a certain duration. They are expected to be able to carry in a certain amount of weight. They are expected to be able to jump so high, shoot so fast, and so forth. And if a person doesn't have those skills, if they're not capable of doing that, then they no longer fit within the operation window of being a ranger. Operation window isn't the right word. Don't at me about it. And in competition, I entered shooting competition quite literally naive. I thought, well, if I have better weapons than mil spec, I'm going to be doing better as a competitor. And sure, I might have shot better that first day because of my equipment than I would have if I wasn't, if I was using something cheaper or less capable, who knows? But the point is that the process of learning began by figuring out what I was wrong about. And I had to learn to shoot better. It wasn't, there were times where changing out a piece of gear, switching out that red dot for an LPVO helped out in shooting competition. But it also meant that I had something else to learn and I had a lot of skills to develop. I learned more about how to draw a handgun quickly and reliably shooting competition than I did while I was in the military. I learned how to reload a pistol or a rifle much faster and more reliably shooting competition than I did in the military. And what I observed in both of these skill sets, whether it was the macro-ish kind of scale of shooting of war fighting or the micro-ish scale of shooting competition, was something that a professor of mine and a dear friend uh, presented to me multiple times in a present. He said this over and over again to me. He would always pull me into his office and he'd tell me the same thing over and over again. He says, the same amount of work it takes to write a 90% paper is how much work it takes to take a 90% paper and make it a 95% paper. So if let's just say it takes you 3 hours to write a paper that's going to get 90%, it's going to take you another 3 hours to take that 90% paper and turn it into a 95% paper. It's going to take you another 3 hours to take that 95% paper and turn it into a 97% paper. It's going to take you another 3 hours to take that 97 to make it a 98, and again to make a 98 a 99, and then finally double that, and you're going to get a 100. And so 3 hours for a 90, 6 hours for a 95, 8 hours or 9 hours for a 97, 12 hours for a 98, 15 hours for a 99, but 21 for a 100. And I'm using the hours mark as sort of like not a specific less of an accurate depiction of the time spent and more of a how much units of effort or units of energy. And when we look at gun culture as a whole, instead of arguing over what you should and shouldn't do, maybe you should and shouldn't learn how to do this or whatever, we are in the process of ironing out for ourselves what skill sets exist at that 90 percentile mark and what skill sets remain at that. Are we seeking to push up to that 100% mark? And when it comes to, you take a competition shooter, the skill set of firing a firearm, using a firearm, is at its peak if they want to get to the top 1%. Maybe, and they very likely will have to forego other options. The the military style or whatever application is going to have to forego certain things. They might not have the time and energy, especially if they're not paid by the US government with all their food and housing provided for. They're going to have an individual's going to have to pick and choose what he's good at. And maybe, and this is where we learn strategies on how to combine things that we already do. What does hunting have to do with ranging a target? What does it have to do with planning a stalk? What does it have to do with terrain and land navigation? These are all skills that we want to develop. Orion Training Group, shout out to those guys, put something up on Instagram lately about, kind of like a sort of video game-esque. It should be, Jared, if you're listening to this, we need to just make it, but a sort of video game-esque skill tree. Where do you go from here to here to here to here? And and what we're looking at now, in conclusion to this, is that the big picture is the gun culture. When you shoot competition, you participate in the greater sphere of gun culture. When you're training with your friends, you're participating in the greater sphere of gun culture. And these things are good for us as a community. Being able to have, each person's going to have kind of their niche and their specialty. They're going to have their crew and their group and the people that they participate with. But that we want to be careful not to let the parts detract from the whole. And when it does that, it doesn't do that by being focused on something. An individual does not subtract from gun culture as a whole by being focused on a certain skill set or minutia of the whole. It's when they substitute that for the whole, as if learning to shoot USPSA is the ultimate of gun culture itself, or being a Navy SEAL is the ultimate of gun culture itself, or being the editor for a magazine is the ultimate of gun culture itself, or being an influencer, or whatever you want to call it. And so what we recognize is that each of us are here together, and we're all a part of this community. It can sound even a little bit soft in the matter, but we contribute by our participation. The things that I saw in the military was my skill sets got better when I was in a squad or a platoon that I got along with, that had a better focus on what their goals were. When the team leaders and squad leaders communicated down to the privates what the mission was and how they would do well and where they could exceed at it. That is where that squad and platoon did well. My life, one of the best summers of my life was in a squad in the military where my team leader and squad leader for the first week didn't say anything to me at all. But by the time I left that squad and platoon, I had developed friendships and more. I knew how to function in that group, and it took investment on my part, and I certainly didn't make it easy at times. But that was one of the best summers of my life, was when the culture of that group was strong because of the willing participation of all the members. And one of the best years of my life was shooting competition the summer of 2016, because I got to meet these people who competed in Minnesota, and I got to spend time with them, and shooting competition became something I looked forward to doing. But the more I receded into myself and pulled away from that community, the more lonely I felt. And one of the best summers of my life was the summer of 2020 when I was an editor for Recoil and working to the capacity of a private military contractor, CONUS. And I was watching with people, alongside people I could trust. I was watching the city that I had lived in tear itself apart with the Summer of Love riots. And what I can look back at 15 years of being a part of gun culture is that I can't force a community to exist, but I can contribute to it. I can be a part of it. I can welcome you in. I can invite you into my home. We can have these conversations. And I can invite people, and some people will still choose not to accept the invitation, and I can't really help you there. But I can invite you in to do stuff with us, to spend time. We're going to be putting on in a couple of days here. Let's see. On the 16th of December, 2023, we're going to be doing a range cleanup in Tucson, Arizona. And we're going to go clean up some public land. I can invite you to that. I can invite people to come out. I can also choose. Sometimes I have to be the person where I volunteer myself to go somewhere. Learning competition. There's already a competition crew. I am not the one in charge. I learn from who's there and I get to make friends and influence people. Thanks, Carnegie. And so, in that sense, the long form answer is while we know that culture comes first, I don't want to talk to you about what culture is. I want to invite you into ours. I want to remind you that we are here together despite all the things that we could complain about. We are a culture. And that is something that I'm thankful for. We have our gripes and our problems, and we have our challenges to overcome. Exemplary in our environment is this: we witness attacks from the outside, and we are continually successful despite challenges. That sounds like a little bit of a cop out. How do I say this one other way? I made this comment on Twitter recently, but I need to restate it here. One of the biggest psyops that you're experiencing today is that there is the idea of a gun control debate. There is no debate. There is no conversation being had in that regards. It is merely tyrants and children whining, fighting against people who have literally spent their lives and their adult lives understanding violence and becoming capable of it and becoming disciplined and understanding how it is used. So you have people who have no experience and worse, no desire to be held to that moral standard of any intellectual integrity at all, in opposition, supposedly pitted in debate against literal experts. And if anyone is going to be surprised by this, the trust the experts line only goes so far as it is politically expedient to one's self. So the challenge then that we face is not necessarily that we are going to win every debate because there are no debates to be had. Rather, we win internally, because I want you, when you wake up in the morning and you choose to carry a firearm and you choose to defend your family and you choose to make these decisions to participate, that you know that you are doing the right thing. I want you to believe that. I want you to know that when you wake up in the morning and you choose to take responsibility for your life, you are doing the right thing. And some people hate you for it. However, if you build your identity on the opposition, then you are simply as weak as they are. Literally the Batman Joker problem, you need me to exist kind of issue. And we are not those people. And so, as I conclude, in 15 years of gun culture, I have observed people voluntarily choose to make their environments better or worse. I have learned to shoot different ways. I have learned different skills, and we have witnessed gun culture move from how owning an AR-15 is a strange thing to not owning an AR-15 is a strange thing. We have moved from Self-defense is something that we choose to do to it's a responsibility that we bear towards our family. We have seen the lines blur between different subsections of the community, and we've seen new faces arrive. And so as we go forward in gun culture, here's a challenge. We talked about the percentage of competitors, and there's the bottom 80%, the middle 20%, and then the top one, or the bottom 80, the middle 19, and the top 1%. In order to get into that top 20% or that top 19%, what it requires is deliberate practice. And so the math kind of adds up. The math adds up like this. Although there's some controversy over it, was it Daniel Coyle's book, The Talent Code, argues that it takes 10,000 hours of practice to become a master at something. And that is a bold calculate. That is one thing that you take some time to calculate out. How many hours a day do you have? How are you going to produce that? But like you learn in both competition and to a different angle in the kind of military tactical space, you have a lot of individual skill sets to learn. So what I'm going to challenge you to do is pick one skill, whether it's drawing from concealment, reloading, or something of that sort, something that is an individual skill. Reloads, swapping magazines, drawing from a holster. Do 100 reps a day for 100 days, and you will have accomplished 10,000 reps, and you will be in the top probably 10% of people with that skill. And that is how long it takes to get into the top 10%. 100 days. It's winter. You've got time to dry fire. So take your equipment, take your phone or whatever you have, film yourself on day 1, and then film yourself on day 100 and see how much you've improved. And if you want to, send that to me. 100 days, 100 reps a day, go and see how far you'll go, because as you contribute to those small components, you will open yourself up to contribute to greater components. What we see in our world is that we start naive. We learn that naivety gets humbled, it gets challenged, and we develop skills. And then that skill set eventually has to become mastery. And what we don't want to see is people go from naivety to offering advice, because that jump requires the work. Put in the work, get there, be there. Be there for your friends and your neighbors, and not everyone has to be an influencer to influence the people around them. And so there's your challenge. 100 days, 100 reps, go. I think it'll take you, if you're going to pick a draw from concealment, it's going to take you about 15 minutes a day. And if you do that every day, set your timer, set your clock and your timer, and do 100 reps a day for 100 days and see how far you'll go. That being the case, if you want to support the show, you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com, and there we will have more interaction on the subject. And if you want to support us in other ways, we've got, I think, 22 stickers of the Don't Be a Loot Drop, which are cyberpunk and glittery. So where we're at is at the home base of, we don't live in the little factory, but was it Lisa Frank comes from where we're living right now? Glitter and bright colors. Don't be a loot drop. We will see you soon. You can find those at redactedllc.com. Don't need to sell it any harder. You know where to find it. You're good people. So if you want to support us, you can head over there, keep the show running. Otherwise than that, in all things, go forth and conquer.